Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when you're not looking for them. Sometimes life changes in the space between one footstep and the next, when you're simply walking the same path you've walked 1,000 times before. Evelyn Torres had been guiding people through the Colorado wilderness for 15 years. She knew every trail, every stream, every place where the morning light first touched the mountain peaks. Her German Shepherd Scout walked beside her, the way he had for 8 years now. On this autumn morning, Scout stopped dead in his tracks. His ears went up, his whole body went still. He was staring at something through the trees that Evelyn had never seen before. An old train car, sitting in a place where no train tracks existed. The metal was rusted, covered in vines. It looked like it had been there for decades, but that was impossible. Evelyn knew these mountains better than anyone. What could drive someone to hide an entire train car in the wilderness, and what secrets lie waiting inside? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The discovery of that impossible train car would haunt Evelyn Torres for the rest of her life. But in that moment, standing among the towering pines with Scout rigid beside her, she simply felt the familiar weight of mystery settling on her shoulders like an old coat. Evelyn had always been drawn to puzzles. Even as a child growing up in Denver, she'd been the one to find lost toys, missing homework, the neighbor's escaped cat. Her mother used to say she had a gift for seeing what others missed, for noticing the small details that told bigger stories. That gift had served her well during her 12 years in the Army, where she'd specialized in search and rescue operations across some of the most challenging terrain in the world. Afghanistan had been her proving ground. The mountains there were different from these Colorado peaks, harsher, more unforgiving, filled with dangers both natural and human-made. But the skills were the same, reading the land, understanding how weather and time changed the landscape, knowing where someone might shelter or hide. She'd saved 43 lives during her service, a number she kept private but never forgot. Each rescue had taught her something new about human nature, about the will to survive, about the stories that landscapes could tell if you knew how to listen. Scout had been part of that world too, though their paths had crossed only in the final year of her service. He'd been assigned to her unit as a military working dog, trained in explosive detection and search operations. From the moment they'd been paired, there had been an understanding between them that went beyond the typical handler-dog relationship. Scout seemed to read her intentions before she voiced them, and Evelyn found herself trusting his instincts even when they contradicted her own analysis. The dog tags he wore now were different from his military ones, but Evelyn had kept the old set in a small wooden box on her dresser. Sometimes when the mountain nights were particularly quiet, she'd take them out and remember the weight of responsibility they'd both carried, the lives that had depended on their ability to work as one mind in two bodies. Coming home from Afghanistan had been harder than going. The transition from life and death decisions to civilian routines had left her feeling unmoored, restless in a way that city life couldn't cure. She'd tried working for a private security firm in Denver, but the corporate environment felt suffocating after years of open sky and crucial missions. The day she'd driven up into the mountains for what was supposed to be a weekend camping trip and found herself not wanting to leave. She'd known she'd found her answer. The cabin she'd eventually bought was 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that kept all but the most determined visitors away. It was simple. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that opened onto a living room dominated by a stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch that offered views of peaks that changed color with the light. She'd spent her first winter there learning to live with the silence, teaching herself to find peace in solitude rather than simply enduring it. Her business as a wilderness guide had grown slowly, built on word-of-mouth recommendations from clients who appreciated her knowledge and her ability to share the mountains without overwhelming them with unnecessary chatter. She specialized in multi-day treks for people who wanted to experience real wilderness, not the sanitized version offered by larger outfitters. Her clients were often people like herself, veterans, professionals recovering from burnout, anyone seeking something authentic in a world that felt increasingly artificial. The town of Cedar Falls, where she picked up supplies and the occasional cup of coffee, had accepted her as one of their own, with the measured warmth typical of mountain communities. Frank Henley, at the hardware store, had stopped asking where she was from after the first year. Maria Santos at the diner had learned to have her coffee ready, black, no sugar, when she came in every other Tuesday. Dr. Patricia Williams, the local veterinarian, had become something approaching a friend, particularly after Scout had tangled with a porcupine during his second summer in the mountains. But even in this close-knit community, Evelyn maintained careful boundaries. People knew she was reliable, competent, and private. They knew she'd been in the military, but not where or what she'd done. They knew she could find anyone lost in the wilderness, but not why that skill came so naturally to her. She'd built a life that honored her need for solitude, while still allowing her to use her talents in service of others. Scout had adapted to their new life, with the resilience typical of military working dogs. The mountains offered him different challenges than Afghanistan, tracking wildlife instead of explosives, navigating rocky terrain instead of urban rubble. But his alert intelligence and protective instincts remained sharp. He'd learned to distinguish between the sounds of hikers on distant trails and the movements of deer through the underbrush. He knew which weather patterns meant they needed to head for shelter, and which clients required extra watching on difficult stretches of trail. This morning had started like so many others. Evelyn had risen before dawn, not from any alarm, but from the internal clock that still operated on military time. She'd made coffee while Scout stretched and yawned on the braided rug before the cold fireplace. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the aspen trees were putting on their annual show of gold against the dark green of the evergreens. Her plan had been simple: a solo reconnaissance hike to check the condition of a trail she'd be using with clients next week. The route took her through familiar territory, past landmarks she'd named for herself over the years: the lightning-split pine, the boulder that looked like a sleeping bear, the meadow where she'd once watched a family of elk graze in the early morning mist. She'd been walking for 2 hours when Scout's behavior changed. It wasn't dramatic. His ears swiveled forward, his gait became more purposeful, his attention focused on something beyond her sensory range. In Afghanistan, such signals had meant the difference between life and death. Here in the peaceful Colorado wilderness, they usually indicated wildlife or perhaps another hiker off the beaten path. But this was different. Scout's body language spoke of confusion rather than recognition, alertness rather than predatory interest. When he finally stopped completely, staring through a gap in the trees with every muscle tensed, Evelyn followed his gaze and felt her own certainty about these familiar mountains shift fundamentally. The train car sat in a small clearing perhaps 50 yards from the trail, positioned as if it had simply rolled to a stop among the trees. The metal sides were dark with rust and age, and ivy had claimed much of the visible surface. But there was something wrong with the scene, something that made Evelyn's trained eye narrow with suspicion. She'd been walking these trails for 8 years. She'd explored every accessible drainage, every hidden meadow, every game trail that branched off the main routes. The idea that something as large as a train car could exist in this location without her knowledge should have been impossible. Yet there it was, solid and undeniable, waiting in the shadows like a secret the forest had been keeping. Scout whined softly, a sound she'd learned to interpret as uncertainty. He was asking for guidance, waiting for her to make sense of what they'd found. Evelyn reached down to rest her hand on his head, feeling the slight tremor of tension in his muscles, and realized that her own hands were shaking slightly. In 12 years of military service and 8 years of guiding in these mountains, she developed an intuitive sense for when situations required caution. The train car felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate, as if its presence violated some natural law she'd taken for granted. But curiosity had always been stronger than caution in Evelyn's makeup. It was what had driven her to volunteer for the most dangerous rescue missions, what had led her to explore every corner of her adopted mountains, what had brought meaning to a life that might otherwise have been defined by solitude. She adjusted her pack, checked that her radio was functioning, and started toward the clearing with Scout moving cautiously at her side. Whatever secrets the train car held, whatever explanation existed for its impossible presence in her wilderness, she was going to find out. The morning sun, filtering through the canopy above, cast shifting patterns of light and shadow across the forest floor as they approached the mystery that would change everything. The closer Evelyn got to the train car, the more wrong everything felt. Scout pressed against her leg, his usual confident stride replaced by careful, measured steps. The forest around them had gone unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. As if the wildlife had learned to avoid this place. The passenger car was older than she'd first thought. Probably from the 1980s, based on the design of the windows and the style of the exterior paneling. But the rust patterns didn't make sense. In this altitude and climate, metal exposed to the elements for 4 decades should have shown different corrosion patterns. More extensive damage from freeze-thaw cycles and mountain weather. Evelyn circled the car slowly, noting details with the systematic approach her military training had drilled into her. The wheels weren't just sitting on the ground, they were partially buried, as if the car had been here long enough for soil and organic matter to accumulate around them. But the vegetation growing over and around the structure told a different story. The ivy covering the sides was mature but not ancient, maybe 15 years of growth at most. The small trees growing near the car were the wrong age for the timeline the buried wheels suggested. Someone had worked very hard to make this train car look like it had been abandoned here for decades. But they'd made mistakes that Evelyn's trained eye could detect. Scout's whine drew her attention to the rear of the car, where a door stood slightly ajar. The opening was narrow, maybe 6 inches, but enough to reveal that the interior was dark and empty, or appeared to be empty. Evelyn had learned long ago that appearances could be the most dangerous lies. She pulled a small flashlight from her pack and approached the door cautiously. The metal hinges showed signs of recent use. No rust buildup, oil stains where someone had kept the mechanism functional. This train car hadn't been abandoned. It had been maintained, visited, used for something that required access. The door opened smoothly when she pulled on it, confirming her suspicion about the hinges. Inside, her flashlight beam revealed a passenger compartment that should have been furnished with rows of seats. Instead, the space had been gutted and modified. Steel rings were bolted to the floor and walls at regular intervals. Scratch marks scarred the wooden surfaces, and dark stains that might have been blood had soaked into the planking. This wasn't an abandoned train car. This was a prison. Scout refused to enter, backing away from the door with a growl that raised the hair on Evelyn's arms. His reaction confirmed what her own instincts were screaming. This place had seen violence, fear, suffering. The dog's senses could detect traces of trauma that her human nose couldn't process. But her military experience could read the signs well enough. The conductor's station at the front of the car had been left more intact, probably to maintain the illusion of a normal passenger car for anyone who might glimpse it from a distance. Evelyn approached it carefully, noting that the floor here showed different wear patterns. Heavier traffic, recent use, the kind of scuffing that came from regular movement rather than abandonment. It was there, tucked behind the conductor's station desk, that she found the first concrete clue. A pocket watch, tarnished silver with an engraved cover, had been wedged into the narrow space between the desk and the wall. When she managed to work it free, her flashlight revealed an inscription: to Robert Chen, 25 years of faithful service, Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, 1987, not 40 years ago, not lost in some historical accident. This watch belonged to someone who had been here in 1987, which meant this train car had been in use just 37 years ago. Recent enough that there should be records, missing person reports, some official acknowledgement of what had happened here. But Evelyn's gut told her there wouldn't be any official records. The careful camouflage, the modified interior, the maintenance of access. This operation had been designed to stay hidden, to keep its secrets buried under carefully cultivated vegetation and deliberate misdirection. She photographed the watch with her phone, careful to capture the inscription and the serial numbers engraved on the case. Then she began a more systematic search of the car, looking for anything else that might provide answers or evidence. In a compartment that had once held emergency equipment, she found pages from what appeared to be a passenger manifest. The papers were water-damaged and partially illegible, but she could make out fragments of names and destinations. What struck her immediately was that none of the destinations were local. These passengers had been traveling long distances, from Denver to locations across the western United States. The manifest pages were dated September 15th, 1987, and listed 12 passengers plus a crew of 3. 15 people who had boarded a train in Denver and, according to this evidence, never reached their intended destinations. Scout's sudden alert bark from outside the car sent adrenaline shooting through Evelyn's system. She grabbed the manifest pages and the watch, secured them in her pack, and moved quickly to the door. The dog was staring toward the tree line, his body rigid with attention. His ears focused on something she couldn't hear. Then she heard it too, the distant sound of an engine growing closer. Someone was driving up the old logging road that passed within a quarter-mile of this location. Someone who might be coming to check on their carefully hidden secret. Evelyn's military training kicked in automatically. She photographed the interior of the car quickly, documenting the steel rings, the stains, the evidence of modification. Then she closed the door carefully, making sure it was positioned exactly as she'd found it, and moved away from the car with Scout at her heels. They took cover behind a fallen log about 40 yards from the clearing, close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid detection. The engine sound grew louder, then stopped. Evelyn could hear car doors slamming, voices, footsteps on forest floor, at least 2 people, possibly 3. Through gaps in the vegetation, she watched 2 men emerge into the clearing. Both were dressed in civilian clothes, but they moved with the purposeful coordination of people accustomed to working together in potentially dangerous situations. One carried a large duffel bag, the other had what looked like cleaning supplies. They approached the train car with obvious familiarity, and when the first man opened the door, he did it with the easy confidence of someone who had performed this action many times before. They entered the car and remained inside for nearly 20 minutes, long enough for Evelyn to realize that this was routine maintenance, not investigation. When they emerged, the man with the duffel bag was carrying something wrapped in plastic. They loaded it into their vehicle, a dark SUV with tinted windows and no visible license plates, and drove away without looking back. Evelyn remained hidden for another 15 minutes, making sure they weren't returning before approaching the train car again. The men had been careful, but they'd left signs of their presence. Tire tracks in the soft earth, footprints around the car and inside. The smell of industrial cleaning products couldn't completely mask the odor of fresh blood. Whatever this place was being used for, it was still active. The train car wasn't a historical crime scene. It was an ongoing operation, and she had just witnessed part of it, standing in that clearing with Scout pressed against her leg and the evidence of recent violence filling her nostrils. Evelyn faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could walk away, pretend she'd never found this place, return to her simple existence as a wilderness guide. Or she could dig deeper into a mystery that was clearly dangerous, that involved people willing to kill to protect their secrets. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. 43 people had trusted her with their lives during her military service, and she'd never failed to bring them home. She couldn't walk away from evidence that 15 people had disappeared in 1987, that others might be suffering or dying in this hidden prison even now. She secured the manifest pages and the conductor's watch in her pack, memorized the tire tread patterns in the soft earth, and started back toward her cabin with Scout. She had evidence to analyze, research to conduct, and plans to make. The peaceful mountain morning had revealed a darkness that would require all her skills to confront. The drive back to her cabin gave Evelyn time to process what she'd witnessed. But the familiar comfort of her truck's interior couldn't dispel the images burned into her memory. The steel rings bolted to the train car floor, the stains that looked too much like dried blood. The casual efficiency of the two men who had treated the location like a routine stop on their workday. Scout rode in the passenger seat with his head turned toward the window, but his ears remained alert, swiveling at every sound. Even he seemed to understand that their peaceful morning had crossed into dangerous territory. At home, Evelyn spread the water-damaged manifest pages on her kitchen table and studied them under a bright lamp. The passenger list was partially legible, and what she could read raised more questions than it answered. The names appeared to be from different ethnic backgrounds: Chen, Rodriguez, Washington, O'Brien, Kowalski. The destinations were scattered across multiple states: Seattle, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, Portland. This hadn't been a regular passenger route. No single train would have served all those destinations in 1987, which meant these people had been traveling on some kind of special transport. Witness protection, perhaps, or a prisoner transfer. But the manifest was printed on civilian railroad letterhead, not government forms. She photographed the pages with her phone and then secured the originals in a waterproof bag. The conductor's watch went into the same bag, wrapped in soft cloth to prevent further damage to the engraving. Her laptop, connected to the cabin's satellite internet, became her research tool. She started with missing person reports from 1987, searching Colorado and surrounding states for any reference to the names she could read from the manifest. Hours of searching through archived newspaper reports and police databases yielded nothing. Not one of the 12 passengers appeared in any missing person report she could find. That absence of information was almost more troubling than finding evidence of their deaths would have been. 15 people don't simply vanish without anyone noticing, unless their disappearance had been orchestrated by people with the power to suppress investigations. Evelyn's next search focused on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad and any special operations they might have conducted in 1987. The railroad had been absorbed by larger companies over the years, but archived records suggested they had occasionally contracted with federal agencies for secure transport of sensitive cargo and personnel. The pieces of a picture were beginning to emerge, but it was a picture that made Evelyn increasingly uncomfortable. Federal agencies, suppressed missing person reports, a train car modified for imprisonment and still being used for something that required regular cleaning and maintenance. She was dealing with something that went far beyond local crime, something that might involve people with significant resources and governmental connections. When her phone rang late that afternoon, the sudden sound in the quiet cabin made both her and Scout jump. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local: Miss Torres. The voice was male, polite but formal. "This is Deputy Sheriff Carl Morrison from Larimer County. I understand you do wilderness guiding in the area." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "That's right. How can I help you?" "We've had reports of someone camping illegally in the national forest, possibly squatting in an old structure. I was wondering if you'd encountered anything unusual during your recent trips into the backcountry." The question was too specific, too perfectly timed to be coincidental. Someone knew she'd been near the train car, and they were testing to see what she might report. "I haven't seen any illegal camping," she said carefully. "What kind of structure are you referring to?" "Old mining equipment, abandoned railroad cars, that sort of thing. The kind of place someone might set up a camp, thinking they wouldn't be disturbed." There it was, the confirmation that law enforcement, or at least someone posing as law enforcement, was aware of the train car's location and was monitoring who might discover it. I'll keep an eye out, Evelyn said. If I see anything that looks like illegal camping, I'll give you a call. I'd appreciate that. And Miss Torres, if you do come across anything unusual, it would be best to report it immediately, rather than investigating on your own. Some of these squatters can be dangerous, especially if they're involved in drug manufacturing or other illegal activities. The warning was clear enough. Stay away, don't investigate, and definitely don't cause problems by asking too many questions. After hanging up, Evelyn sat in her kitchen chair, staring at the manifest pages spread before her. Deputy Sheriff Morrison's call confirmed that she was already on someone's radar, that her discovery of the train car hadn't gone unnoticed. The two men she'd observed had probably reported seeing fresh footprints or other signs of an unauthorized visitor. Scout padded over and rested his chin on her knee, sensing her tension. She scratched behind his ears and felt the familiar comfort of his steady presence. In Afghanistan, she'd learned to trust his instincts about danger, even when her own assessment suggested safety. His unease at the train car had been unmistakable, and his continued alertness suggested the danger hadn't passed with their return home. Her military contacts might be able to provide insight into what she'd discovered, but reaching out to them would create a paper trail that might draw unwanted attention. Still, the magnitude of what she was dealing with, the potential federal involvement, the ongoing nature of whatever operation was using the train car, demanded expertise beyond her own capabilities. Evelyn made two decisions before the sun set that evening. First, she would return to the train car for a more thorough investigation, but she would go prepared for the possibility of encountering the people who were using it. Second, she would contact the one person from her military service who she trusted completely and who had the security, clearance and connections to provide guidance without creating unnecessary exposure. Colonel James Hartwell had been her commanding officer during her final 2 years in Afghanistan, and he'd been the one to recommend her for the specialized search and rescue training that had saved so many lives. More importantly, he'd been the one to help her navigate the transition to civilian life when her service ended. If anyone could provide insight into federal operations involving hidden transportation and missing persons, it would be Colonel Hartwell. She composed a carefully worded email that evening, describing her discovery in terms that would be clear to someone with military intelligence experience, but vague enough to avoid triggering automated surveillance systems. She mentioned finding evidence of a historical transportation incident with federal implications and requested a secure phone conversation. The response came back within an hour, which told her that Colonel Hartwell was taking her inquiry seriously. The message contained only a phone number and a time. Call at 0800 tomorrow. Use encryption. Evelyn understood. Whatever she'd stumbled into was significant enough to require secure communications and immediate attention from someone who dealt with classified operations. That night, she slept fitfully, waking several times to check the locks on her doors and windows. Scout spent the night on the floor beside her bed instead of in his usual spot by the fireplace. And twice she heard him growl softly at sounds outside that her own ears couldn't detect. The peaceful isolation she'd cultivated for 8 years had been shattered in a single morning, replaced by the kind of vigilance she'd thought she'd left behind in Afghanistan. But along with the tension came a familiar sense of purpose, the knowledge that she was once again involved in something that mattered, something that could make a difference in other people's lives. 12 passengers and 3 crew members had disappeared in 1987. And someone was still using their prison for purposes that required fresh blood to be cleaned away. Tomorrow's conversation with Colonel Hartwell would determine how far down this dangerous path she was willing to go. The encrypted phone call with Colonel Hartwell began at precisely 0800, and his first words confirmed Evelyn's worst suspicions. "Torres, I need you to be very careful about what you found," he said without preamble. "Can you give me exact coordinates?" She provided the GPS location of the train car and heard him typing in the background. "Jesus Christ," he muttered after a moment. "That location was flagged in our system as recently as 6 months ago. There's an active federal investigation, but it's compartmentalized way above my clearance level. Active investigation into what? I can't get details, but the file references missing federal witnesses from the 1980s and potential ongoing operations. Torres, this isn't some cold case you stumbled into. This is live, current, and dangerous. Colonel Hartwell's warning only strengthened Evelyn's resolve. Sir, I found evidence that 15 people disappeared in 1987, and yesterday I witnessed 2 men cleaning what looked like fresh blood from inside that train car. Whatever happened in the past, it's still happening now. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Evelyn wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Colonel Hartwell spoke again, his voice careful and measured. I'm going to give you a contact, someone who's been working this case longer than anyone else should have to work any case. But Torres, once you make this call, you're committed. There's no going back to your quiet mountain life. I understand, sir. Her name is Agent Patricia Cortez, FBI. She's been investigating witness protection failures for nearly 4 decades. If anyone can tell you what you're dealing with, it's her. But Evelyn, his use of her first name caught her attention. She's been burned by this case more than once. People she trusted sold her out. Witnesses she was protecting died. Investigations she built were shut down from above. She doesn't trust easily, and she has good reason. Colonel Hartwell provided a secure phone number and specific protocols for contacting Agent Cortez. After ending the call, Evelyn sat in her kitchen drinking coffee and staring out at the peaceful mountain landscape that no longer felt like sanctuary. Scout's sudden bark drew her attention to the window facing the road. A vehicle was approaching, not the familiar engine sound of her neighbors, but something larger and heavier. Through the trees, she caught glimpses of a dark SUV similar to the one she'd seen at the train car. Evelyn's military training kicked in automatically. She grabbed her go-bag, secured the manifest pages and conductor's watch, and moved to a position where she could observe the approaching vehicle without being seen. Scout positioned himself at her side, alert but silent. The SUV stopped at the end of her driveway, just far enough away that she couldn't read the license plate clearly. 2 men got out, different from the ones she'd seen at the train car, but with the same purposeful bearing. One remained by the vehicle, while the other walked up her driveway. Not toward the house, but toward the area where she parked her truck. She watched through binoculars as he examined her truck, paying particular attention to the tires and undercarriage. He was looking for evidence that she'd driven on the logging roads near the train car, checking for specific mud or vegetation that would confirm her presence at the location. After 10 minutes of careful examination, the man returned to the SUV. They sat there for another quarter hour, obviously observing her cabin. Before driving away, the message was clear. They knew who she was, where she lived, and they were watching to see what she would do next. Evelyn waited 2 hours before returning to the train car, taking a circuitous route through terrain that would reveal anyone following her. This time, she came prepared with professional investigation equipment, evidence bags, a metal detector, cameras with telephoto lenses, and the small forensics kit she'd assembled during her military service. Scout's reluctance to approach the train car was even more pronounced than before, but he followed her lead with the disciplined obedience of his military training. The clearing was empty, but Evelyn could see fresh tire tracks and footprints from multiple visitors since her last visit. Her systematic search of the car's interior revealed details she'd missed in her initial shocked exploration. The steel rings weren't just randomly placed. They formed a pattern designed to secure specific numbers of people in specific positions. Someone had engineered this space for maximum control and minimum comfort, but it was her discovery of a small brass key, taped to the underside of the conductor's desk, that opened an entirely new dimension to the mystery. The key was too small for the car's exterior doors, but perfectly sized for something like a locker or storage compartment. 20 minutes of careful searching revealed what the key unlocked. A hidden compartment built into the car's floor, concealed so carefully that only someone looking specifically for it would ever find it. Inside the compartment, wrapped in waterproof plastic, were items that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Personal effects, watches, jewelry, glasses, a child's small teddy bear. Each item was tagged with a date and what appeared to be initials. The dates ranged from 1987 to just 6 months ago, creating a timeline of victims that spanned nearly 4 decades. Among the personal effects was something that changed everything: a military communication device. Old but still functional, still charged. When Evelyn activated it, the display showed recent message logs, communications between someone using the call sign Phoenix and another using Control. The messages were brief but chilling. Package delivered. Cleanup required. Understood. Standard protocols. Next delivery scheduled for November 15th. Confirmed. Route Alpha. November 15th was 3 weeks away. Whatever operation was using this train car, it wasn't finished. More people were going to disappear. More personal effects were going to join the collection in the hidden compartment. Evelyn photographed everything, secured samples in evidence bags, and carefully returned the compartment to its original state. But as she prepared to leave, Scout's low growl warned her that they were no longer alone. Through the trees, she could see movement. At least 3 people approaching the clearing from different directions, moving with the coordinated precision of a tactical team. They had been watching the location, waiting for her to return, and now they were closing in. Evelyn's military training had prepared her for exactly this situation. She knew these forests better than anyone, and she had scout senses to guide her through terrain that would challenge even experienced trackers. But she also knew that escape was only the first step in what had become a much larger battle. The evidence she'd gathered proved that the 1987 disappearances were part of an ongoing operation, that people were still dying, and that powerful forces were committed to keeping their secrets buried. Agent Patricia Cortez might be her only ally in exposing the truth, but reaching her would require surviving the next few hours. Evelyn signaled Scout to follow, and melted into the forest with the silence and efficiency that had made her one of the Army's most successful search and rescue specialists. Behind her, she could hear the tactical team reaching the train car, their voices sharp with frustration when they found no trace of their target. The hunt had begun in earnest, but Evelyn Torres had spent 12 years learning how to survive when the odds were against her. She had evidence, she had skills, and she had a partner whose loyalty had been proven in the mountains of Afghanistan. Most importantly, she had a purpose that burned stronger than her desire for safety. 15 people had died in 1987, and more would die in November unless she stopped it. Evelyn reached her truck by following game trails and creek beds that kept her movement hidden from the roads. The military communication device she'd retrieved from the train car remained active in her pack, and twice during her escape, she'd heard it emit soft signals that suggested ongoing communications between the tactical team and their controllers. From the safety of her cabin, she contacted Agent Patricia Cortez using the protocols Colonel Hartwell had provided. The conversation that followed changed everything she thought she understood about what she'd discovered. Miss Torres. Agent Cortez's voice was crisp, professional, but carried an undertone of exhaustion that spoke of decades of frustration. Colonel Hartwell briefed me on your situation. I need to know exactly what you found at those coordinates. Evelyn described the train car, the hidden compartment, the personal effects, and the communication device. When she mentioned the military radio, Agent Cortez's sharp intake of breath was audible across the encrypted connection. That communication device, is it still functional? Are you receiving traffic? Yes, ma'am. I've intercepted several brief exchanges about deliveries and cleanup operations. Miss Torres, what you found is evidence of Operation Sanctuary, a witness protection transport program that officially never existed. In 1987, 15 federal witnesses were being moved to secure locations when their train disappeared between Denver and Salt Lake City. The official report claimed mechanical failure and a derailment in a remote canyon, but no wreckage was ever found. Agent Cortez's explanation provided context for the manifest pages Evelyn had discovered, but it also raised new questions about the scope of the conspiracy. The witnesses were testifying against a corruption network that reached into federal law enforcement, state government, and organized crime, Agent Cortez continued. Their testimony would have brought down dozens of officials and led to hundreds of prosecutions. Instead, they vanished, the cases collapsed, and the corrupt network survived. "But you said the operation officially never existed," Evelyn said. "How could witnesses disappear from a program that wasn't real?" "Because Operation Sanctuary was a black operation, funded through classified channels and run by people who reported to no one. When those witnesses became inconvenient, they were eliminated. But here's what makes this case personal for me, Ms. Torres. I was supposed to be on that train. The revelation hit Evelyn like a physical blow. You were one of the witnesses. I was an undercover federal agent who had infiltrated the corruption network. My testimony was going to be the keystone that brought down the entire operation. At the last minute, my handler pulled me off the transport, said there were security concerns. I thought I was being protected. Instead, I was being saved, so I could spend the next 37 years watching guilty people walk free." Agent Cortez's voice carried a weight of survivor's guilt that Evelyn recognized from her own military experience. "I've been investigating this case unofficially ever since, trying to find evidence that would reopen the prosecutions. What you've discovered, the train car, the communication device, the evidence that the operation is still active, this could finally be enough." "What do you mean, still active?" "The corruption network didn't just survive the 1987 cover-up, it evolved. They've been using that train car as a disposal site for anyone who threatens to expose them. Federal witnesses, investigative journalists, whistleblowers, anyone who gets too close to the truth disappears, and their personal effects end up in that hidden compartment." The scope of what Evelyn had uncovered was staggering. 37 years of murder and cover-up, protected by people in positions of power who had the resources to make investigations disappear. Agent Cortez, the communication device intercepted messages about a delivery scheduled for November 15th. "Someone else is going to die if we don't stop this." "I know. I've been tracking their patterns for decades, and November 15th fits their timeline. But, Ms. Torres, you need to understand what you're up against. These people have killed federal agents, judges, prosecutors, anyone who threatens them. They have resources, connections, and no moral boundaries. Then why haven't you stopped them?" The silence stretched long enough that Evelyn wondered if she'd crossed a line with the question. When Agent Cortez spoke again, her voice was quieter, more personal. "Because every time I've gotten close, people I trusted sold me out. Evidence disappeared from secure facilities. Witnesses died in accidents. Investigations were shut down by people whose names I never learned. After 37 years, I've realized that the corruption goes deeper than anyone imagined. But you're still trying. Because Patricia Martinez was my partner, and she died on that train. Because Robert Chen left behind a wife and 2 children who never learned what happened to him. Because 15 good people trusted the system to protect them, and the system murdered them instead." Evelyn understood. This wasn't just about justice. It was about honor, about keeping faith with the dead, about ensuring that their sacrifice had meaning. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to keep that communication device active and monitor their traffic. I need detailed photos of everything in that hidden compartment. And I need you to stay alive long enough for us to gather enough evidence to blow this wide open. They know about me. They've been watching my cabin, following me. How long before they decide I'm too dangerous to leave alone?" "Not long," Agent Cortez admitted. "But you have advantages they don't expect. You know those mountains better than they do. You have military training they probably don't know about, and you have evidence they don't know you've found. What about backup? Can you bring in other agents?" "I don't know who to trust within the Bureau. 37 years of watching investigations get sabotaged has made me very careful about who I share information with. For now, it's just you and me. The isolation of their position was both terrifying and clarifying. Evelyn had spent 8 years building a life defined by solitude, but this was different. This was the isolation of people fighting powerful enemies without institutional support. "There's something else," Agent Cortez said. "I've been in contact with Sarah Chen, Robert Chen's daughter. She's been searching for answers about her father's disappearance since she was 12 years old. She deserves to know what happened to him. Is it safe to involve her? Probably not. But she's been investigating this on her own for years, and she's already at risk. She might be safer working with us than trying to find answers on her own." The communication device in Evelyn's pack crackled with incoming traffic, interrupting their conversation. She activated the speaker so Agent Cortez could hear the exchange. "Phoenix to control. Target acquired surveillance data. Recommend immediate action. Control to Phoenix. Authorization granted. Clean protocols. Understood. Initiating tonight." The transmission ended, leaving silence that felt heavy with threat. Evelyn and Agent Cortez both understood what they'd just heard. The corruption network had decided she was too dangerous to leave alive. "Ms. Torres, you need to disappear tonight. Don't go home. Don't contact anyone. Don't use credit cards or phones. They're coming for you. What about the evidence? What about the November 15th operation? We'll figure that out after you're safe. Right now, survival is your only priority." But even as Agent Cortez spoke, Evelyn was making a different calculation. She had evidence that could expose 37 years of murder and corruption. She had intercepted communications about an upcoming operation that would claim more lives. And she had skills and knowledge that might be the key to finally bringing justice for Patricia Martinez, Robert Chen, and 13 other people who had trusted the system to protect them. Running might keep her alive, but it would also ensure that the November 15th operation proceeded as planned, that more families would spend decades wondering what happened to their loved ones. Agent Cortez, I appreciate the advice, but I'm not running. These people chose the wrong mountains to play their games in, and they chose the wrong person to threaten, Mrs. Torres. They're coming tonight. Let them come. But they're going to find out that some people don't disappear as easily as they expect. Evelyn ended the call and began preparations for a different kind of battle than she'd fought in Afghanistan, but one that would require all the same skills and determination that had made her one of the Army's most effective soldiers. Scout seemed to sense the change in her demeanor, moving from protective alertness to the focused readiness he'd shown during their most dangerous missions. Together, they would face whatever came through the mountain darkness, and they would make sure that the corruption network learned what it meant to threaten someone who had spent 12 years bringing people home against impossible odds. The next morning brought news that changed everything again. Agent Cortez called at dawn with information that reframed the entire investigation. "I've been in contact with Sarah Chen, and she's been maintaining her own files on her father's disappearance. Miss Torres, she's found something that connects to what you discovered." Sarah Chen's voice joined the conference call, and Evelyn could hear the same determined intensity that had driven her own pursuit of the truth. "Miss Torres, my father kept a personal journal that wasn't found with his other belongings when he disappeared. I've had it for 25 years, and it details conversations he had with other witnesses in the weeks before the transport. They knew they were in danger. What kind of danger? Someone was leaking information about Operation Sanctuary to the corruption network. My father wrote about meetings where witnesses discussed their suspicions that their identities had been compromised, that the people supposed to protect them might be working for the other side. This revelation provided crucial context for what Evelyn had found in the train car's hidden compartment. The witnesses hadn't been ambushed by random criminals. They'd been betrayed by people they trusted. "There's more," Sarah continued. "My father identified 3 specific people he suspected of being compromised: Deputy Director Marcus Webb of the U.S. Marshals Service, Federal Prosecutor Janet Morrison, and Detective Lieutenant Paul Hendricks of the Denver Police Department." Agent Cortez's sharp intake of breath was audible. Marcus Webb is now director of the U.S. Marshal Service. Janet Morrison became a federal judge. Paul Hendricks retired as chief of police and now works as a security consultant for major corporations. They're all still alive, still in positions of power, Evelyn said. 37 years later, the people who murdered those witnesses are running the agencies that are supposed to investigate crimes like this, which is why every investigation into Operation Sanctuary has been sabotaged, Agent Cortez said. These people haven't just been covering up their past crimes, they've been building careers on the foundation of murder. Sarah Chen's voice carried the pain of decades of frustrated searching. I've tried to investigate them myself over the years, but every time I got close to something significant, obstacles appeared. Records would be sealed, witnesses would refuse to talk, investigators would be transferred to other cases. They've been watching you, Agent Cortez said. Probably since you were old enough to ask questions about your father's disappearance. They've been managing your investigation, allowing you to find enough to keep you hoping, but nothing that could actually threaten them. The manipulation was staggering in its scope and cruelty. For 25 years, Sarah Chen had been unknowingly dancing to the tune of her father's killers. Her desperate search for answers used as an early warning system for any real threats to their security. But something's changed, Evelyn said. The communication device I intercepted suggests they're more worried now than they've been in years. Why? Because time is running out, Agent Cortez explained. Marcus Webb is retiring next year, Janet Morrison has health problems, Paul Hendricks is in his 70s. The original conspirators are reaching the end of their careers, and they're trying to clean up loose ends before they lose the institutional power to protect themselves. The November 15th operation, Sarah said. It's not just another murder. It's part of a larger cleanup. Agent Cortez confirmed her suspicion. I've been tracking unusual activity in witness protection, federal investigations, and certain corporate security operations. Multiple people who could potentially threaten the network have been identified and are being systematically eliminated. How many people are we talking about? At least a dozen, possibly more. Investigators, journalists, former associates who might have kept records, anyone who represents a potential threat to the conspiracy's continued secrecy. The scope of the planned operation was breathtaking. After 37 years of individual murders and isolated cover-ups, the corruption network was preparing to eliminate multiple threats simultaneously. We have to stop it, Evelyn said. With what resources? Agent Cortez asked. 3 people against a network that includes federal directors, judges, and police chiefs. A network that has unlimited resources and no moral constraints. We have something they don't expect, Sarah said. We have my father's journal, with details about their operations that they thought died with him. We have the evidence Ms. Torres found in the train car. And we have the element of surprise. Evelyn understood what Sarah was suggesting. For 37 years, the corruption network had operated under the assumption that all evidence of Operation Sanctuary had been destroyed, that all witnesses were dead, that their secrets were buried. The discovery that evidence survived, that someone had been building a case against them all these years, would shake their confidence and force them into mistakes. There's something else, Agent Cortez said quietly. I haven't been entirely honest with you about my situation. I haven't been investigating this case as a private citizen for 37 years. I've been working undercover, with authorization from a very small group of people in the Justice Department, who have been building a case against the corruption network. The revelation stunned both Evelyn and Sarah into silence. You're still FBI? Evelyn asked. I'm still federal law enforcement, but my actual status is classified above your clearance level. What matters is that I haven't been working alone, and the evidence you've found is exactly what we've been waiting for. Why didn't you tell us this before? Because trust has to be earned, even among people fighting the same enemy. I needed to know that you were committed to seeing this through, that you weren't going to run when things got dangerous. Sarah's voice was sharp with anger. You've been testing us while my father's killers walk free? I've been protecting an investigation that took 37 years to build. If I'd been wrong about either of you, if you'd been compromised, or if you'd leaked information, dozens of people would have died and the network would have disappeared forever. The tension in the conversation was palpable, but Evelyn understood Agent Cortez's position. In the war against corruption that reached the highest levels of law enforcement, paranoia wasn't a character flaw. It was a survival skill. "What kind of backup do you have?" Evelyn asked. "A small team of investigators and prosecutors who have been working outside normal channels. People who've been chosen specifically because they have no connections to the agencies and officials we're investigating." "How small?" "Small enough that we still need your help. The train car you found is the physical evidence we've been missing for decades. The communication device is giving us real-time intelligence on their operations, and your knowledge of the terrain could be crucial in stopping the November 15th operation." Evelyn made her decision. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep monitoring their communications. Document everything in that hidden compartment, and be ready to guide a federal tactical team to that location when we're ready to make arrests." "What about the immediate threat?" "They're planning to eliminate me tonight." "Let them try," Agent Cortez said with grim satisfaction. "It's time for the hunters to become the hunted." For the first time since discovering the train car, Evelyn felt like she was part of a team with a real chance of success. The corruption network that had murdered 15 people in 1987 and continued killing for 37 years was about to learn that their victims had not been forgotten, and that justice delayed was not justice denied. The truth, when it finally emerged, came from the last place Evelyn expected to find it, hidden in the deepest compartment of the train car. Behind a false panel that required both the brass key and knowledge of a specific sequence to open was a cache of items that reframed everything she thought she understood about Operation Sanctuary. The most shocking discovery was a set of federal credentials belonging to Agent Patricia Martinez, not a victim of the Nautosin massacre, but an undercover federal agent who had survived by allowing everyone, including her own partner, to believe she was dead. "My name is Patricia Cortez now," the woman Evelyn had been speaking with explained during their next communication. "Patricia Martinez died in that train car 37 years ago, but I survived by staying hidden, by building a new identity, and by spending every day since then hunting the people who killed my colleagues." Evelyn stared at the credentials in her hands, trying to process the implications. "You've been alive all this time. Agent Cortez, Agent Martinez, why didn't you reveal yourself? Why let everyone think you were dead?" "Because revealing myself would have meant dying for real. The corruption network had infiltrators everywhere. FBI, U.S. Marshals, Justice Department, local police. If I'd surfaced, they would have killed me within days. The only way to stay alive was to stay dead." The deception was staggering in its scope and duration. For 37 years, Patricia Martinez had been building a shadow case against the corruption network, documenting their crimes, tracking their evolution, waiting for the right moment to strike. "The train car wasn't just a crime scene," she continued. "It was my base of operations. I've been using it to gather evidence, to monitor their communications, to track their movements. Every time they brought someone there to kill them, I was watching, recording, building the case that would eventually destroy them." "You were there when they brought people to murder them?" Sarah Chen's voice was sharp with horror. "I was there, but I couldn't save them without revealing myself and ending any chance of stopping the larger operation. 15 people died in 1987, but hundreds more would have died over the years if I hadn't stayed hidden and kept building evidence." The moral calculus was brutal, but Evelyn understood it from her military experience. Sometimes the greater good required watching smaller evils unfold, gathering intelligence that could prevent larger catastrophes. "The personal effects in the hidden compartment," Evelyn said. "You collected them. I documented every murder, every victim, every piece of evidence that could eventually be used to prosecute their killers. That compartment contains proof of 43 murders spanning 37 years. 43 murders. The number hit Evelyn like a physical blow, especially given its eerie parallel to the 43 lives she'd saved during her own military service. "Why now?" Sarah asked. "Why reveal yourself after all these years?" "Because they're planning something that will end my ability to gather evidence and bring them to justice. The November 15th operation isn't just about eliminating current threats. It's about destroying the train car and all the evidence I've collected. They've finally figured out that someone has been watching them, and they're preparing to eliminate any possibility of exposure." The stakes had just escalated beyond anything Evelyn had imagined. This wasn't just about stopping a single murder or exposing a historical crime. It was about preserving evidence of 4 decades of systematic killing and corruption. "What's the plan for November 15? Evelyn asked. "They're bringing all their current targets to the train car location for simultaneous elimination. Then they're going to destroy the entire site with explosives. No bodies, no evidence, no witnesses, just a controlled avalanche that will bury everything under tons of rock and make the location permanently inaccessible." "How many targets?" 12 people. Journalists who've been investigating corruption, former associates who kept records, family members like Sarah who've been asking too many questions, and federal agents like me who they suspect but can't prove are still alive. Sarah's voice was tight with controlled anger. "They're going to kill 12 people just to cover up crimes from 1987? They're going to kill 12 people to protect the criminal empire they've built over 37 years. The corruption network that started with a few compromised officials has grown into a multi-billion-dollar operation that reaches into government, law enforcement, and corporate America. Those 12 people represent the only remaining threats to their continued existence." Evelyn was beginning to understand the true scope of what they were fighting. This wasn't just a cover-up of historical crimes. It was the protection of an ongoing criminal enterprise that had used government resources and authority to build vast wealth and power. "Agent Martinez, you said you've been working with a small team in the Justice Department. Are they ready to act?" "They've been ready for years, but we've never had enough evidence to guarantee successful prosecutions. The corruption network has survived this long because they've been very careful to eliminate evidence and witnesses before cases could go to trial. But now we have the train car, the hidden compartment, the personal effects of 43 victims, all of which will be destroyed on November 15th unless we stop them. And if we act too early, if we reveal what we know before we can gather additional evidence and make simultaneous arrests, they'll disappear and resurface somewhere else with new identities and new operations. The timing was crucial. Act too soon, and the corruption network would escape to continue their crimes elsewhere. Wait too long, and all evidence of their decades of murder would be destroyed forever. "There's one more thing," Agent Martinez said quietly. "The communication device you've been monitoring. They know you have it. They've been feeding you information to track your movements and identify your contacts. That's how they learned about your communication with Colonel Hartwell, your contact with me, and Sarah's involvement. The revelation that they'd been manipulated was crushing, but Evelyn's military training helped her process the tactical implications quickly. So they know everything we've been planning. They know what we've wanted them to know. Yes, they're aware that you found the train car and that you've been investigating. But they don't know about the deeper evidence, the 43 victim files, or the fact that I've been alive and building a case for 37 years. You've been playing them the same way they've been playing us. I've been using their own arrogance against them. They've assumed that because they've been successful for so long, because they've eliminated everyone who threatened them in the past, that they're untouchable. They can't conceive of the possibility that someone has been systematically documenting their crimes for decades. The conversation was interrupted by activity on the communication device. Multiple voices, coordinates being exchanged, final preparations for the November 15th operation being confirmed. Phoenix to control. All targets confirmed for extraction. Site preparation proceeding on schedule. Control to Phoenix. Weather window optimal. Proceed with final phase authorization. Understood. Operation Sanctuary conclusion. Authorized for November 15th. Through 300 hours. The irony of the code name wasn't lost on any of them. Operation Sanctuary, which had begun as a legitimate witness protection program, had become the name for the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened to expose its corruption. "We have to stop them," Sarah said. "We will stop them," Agent Martinez replied. "But we're going to do it in a way that ensures justice for all 43 victims, not just the 12 they're planning to kill. The November 15th operation is going to be their undoing, but only if we're smart enough to turn their own plan against them." Evelyn felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the same feeling she'd experienced before every crucial mission in Afghanistan. People's lives depended on her skills, her knowledge, and her ability to execute a plan under extreme pressure. But this time, she wasn't just trying to save the 12 people targeted for November 15th. She was fighting for justice for 43 victims whose deaths had been hidden for decades. For the honor of colleagues like Patricia Martinez, who had sacrificed everything to keep faith with the dead, and for the principle that no one should be above the law, no matter how powerful they became. The final battle for Operation Sanctuary was about to begin. The next 48 hours transformed Evelyn's quiet mountain cabin into a strategic command center. Agent Martinez had finally revealed the full scope of her operation, and the resources at their disposal were far more extensive than Evelyn had imagined. The small team I mentioned, Agent Martinez explained during a secure video conference, isn't as small as I led you to believe. We have assets in the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Inspector General's Office, and federal courts. What we've lacked is the physical evidence and real-time intelligence to coordinate simultaneous arrests across multiple jurisdictions. The screen showed 3 other faces: Deputy Attorney General Rebecca Walsh, FBI Deputy Director Michael Santos, and Inspector General Thomas Reed. These weren't junior investigators working outside normal channels. These were senior federal officials who had been building a parallel case against the corruption network for years. "Ms. Torres," the Deputy Attorney General Walsh said, "your discovery of the train car and Agent Martinez's evidence cache represents the breakthrough we've been waiting for. We now have sufficient evidence to bring prosecutions that will survive appeals and political pressure." FBI Deputy Director Santos leaned forward in his frame. "The communication device you've been monitoring has given us unprecedented insight into their operational planning. We know exactly when and where they're planning to eliminate their targets, which means we can turn their final operation into a mass arrest." "What about the targets?" Sarah Chen asked. "The 12 people they're planning to kill, are they being protected?" "That's where the operation gets complicated," Inspector General Reed explained. "Some of the targets don't know they're in danger, and we can't warn them without alerting the corruption network that we're aware of their plans. Others are already under loose surveillance by assets we haven't been able to identify." Agent Martinez pulled up a tactical display showing the train car location and surrounding terrain. The November 15th operation is planned to unfold in 3 phases. First, the targets will be brought to the site between midnight and 3 a.m. Second, they'll be eliminated in the train car using the same methods employed for 37 years. Third, the entire site will be destroyed with explosives at dawn, creating an avalanche that will bury all evidence permanently. Evelyn studied the topographical map, recognizing every ridge, valley, and approach route. "How many people are we talking about for their operational team?" "Our intelligence suggests at least 24 individuals," Deputy Director Santos said. "Tactical teams for target acquisition, security teams for site control, and technical teams for the explosive demolition." 24 trained operatives, Evelyn said. "How many do we have?" "Including Agent Martinez and yourself. We have 18 federal agents and tactical officers who can be positioned in the area without triggering their surveillance networks. The numbers were concerning, but Evelyn had learned in Afghanistan that tactical advantage often mattered more than numerical superiority. Agent Martinez, you know their procedures better than anyone. What's their biggest vulnerability? Arrogance, she replied without hesitation. They've been successful for so long that they've become overconfident. They're planning this operation the same way they've conducted every elimination for 37 years, with the assumption that no one is watching. No one is prepared, and no one can stop them, but they know Evelyn's been investigating, Sarah pointed out. They've been tracking her movements. They know she found the train car and that she's been asking questions, Agent Martinez said. But they don't know about the evidence cache. They don't know I'm alive, and they don't know that we've been building a federal case for years. They think they're dealing with one curious wilderness guide, not a coordinated law enforcement operation. Deputy Attorney General Walsh brought up the legal framework for the operation. We have sealed indictments ready for 37 individuals, including Director Webb, Judge Morrison, and former Chief Hendricks. The moment we have physical evidence and witness testimony to support the charges, we'll execute arrests simultaneously across 6 states. What's the timeline? Evelyn asked. The arrests have to happen during the November 15th operation, Inspector General Reed explained. If we act before then, the targets will scatter and we'll lose our opportunity. If we wait until after, the evidence will be destroyed and the targets will be dead. Agent Martinez outlined the tactical plan. We'll have surveillance teams positioned around the perimeter starting November 14th. When the corruption network begins bringing targets to the site, we'll document everything, the kidnappings, the transport, the intended murders. Then just before they can eliminate the targets, federal tactical teams will move in for simultaneous arrests. What about the explosives? Sarah asked. If they're planning to destroy the site, what happens if something goes wrong and they detonate early? That's where Ms. Torres becomes crucial, Deputy Director Santos said. We need someone who knows the terrain well enough to guide our teams through approach routes that avoid the blast zone. Someone who can coordinate tactical movement in difficult mountain conditions. Evelyn felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 43 victims were depending on her to help bring their killers to justice. 12 potential victims needed her to prevent their murder. And dozens of federal agents would be relying on her knowledge of the terrain to execute a complex operation in challenging conditions. I'll need detailed information about your team capabilities, she said. Mountain operations require different skills than urban tactical work. What kind of training do your people have? Mixed, Agent Martinez admitted. Some are experienced in wilderness operations. Others are specialists in organized crime investigations. We've been preparing for this operation for months, but most of the team hasn't worked in terrain like this before. Then we need to use the geography as our advantage rather than trying to overcome it, Evelyn said, studying the tactical map. The corruption network chose this location because it's isolated and difficult to access. But that same isolation works against them if we control the approach routes. She began sketching modifications to their tactical plan, drawing on years of experience in mountain operations. There are 3 ways to reach the train car by vehicle, but 7 ways to approach on foot. If we position teams here, here, and here, she marked specific locations, we can control all vehicle access while maintaining overwatch of the entire operation. What about escape routes? Inspector General Reed asked. If some of the operatives realize they're walking into a trap, the terrain limits their options, Evelyn explained. There are only 2 ways out of that valley that don't require technical climbing equipment. We can channel their movement into areas where our teams will be waiting. Agent Martinez pulled up surveillance photos of the corruption network's key operatives. These are the primary targets for arrest. Marcus Webb, Janet Morrison, Paul Hendricks, and 9 other officials who have been involved in murders and cover-ups over the past 37 years. Evelyn recognized some of the faces from news reports and official photos, people who had built distinguished careers on the foundation of murder and corruption. "What happens after the arrests?" Sarah asked. "Assuming everything goes according to plan, what's the timeline for prosecutions?" Deputy Attorney General Walsh answered. "With the evidence Agent Martinez has collected and the documentation from the November 15th operation, we expect to begin trials within 6 months. The cases are solid enough that we anticipate guilty verdicts on most charges. What about the victims' families?" Sarah's voice carried the pain of 37 years of searching for answers about her father's death. "When will they learn what happened to their loved ones?" "We'll begin family notifications within days of the arrests," Inspector General Reed said. "It's going to be difficult news for many people, but at least they'll finally have answers." The conversation was interrupted by activity on the communication device. Multiple transmissions indicated that the corruption network was beginning final preparations for the November 15th operation. Phoenix to control. Advanced team deploying to site. Perimeter security establishing. Control to Phoenix. Target acquisition proceeding on schedule. First delivery estimated U-100 hours. Understood. Site preparation complete. Standing by for operations commencement. Agent Martinez checked her watch. 18 hours until they begin bringing targets to the site. 12 hours until our teams need to be in position. Evelyn felt the familiar pre-mission tension building in her chest. The combination of anticipation and responsibility that had defined every crucial operation in Afghanistan. But this mission was different, more personal, more complex, with stakes that reached far beyond military objectives. "Agent Martinez," she said, "there's something I need to know before we commit to this operation. In 37 years of building this case, are you absolutely certain that justice is possible? That we can stop them without losing the people they're planning to kill?" The older agent was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of determination. "Ms. Torres, I watched 15 good people die in that train car in 1987, and I've documented the murders of 28 more people over the years since then. I've spent 37 years of my life building a case for justice, not revenge. Yes, I'm certain that justice is possible. And yes, I'm certain that we can save those 12 people while bringing their killers to trial. Then let's make sure that Patricia Martinez, Robert Chen, and 41 other victims finally get the justice they've been waiting for." The final preparation phase began immediately, with tactical teams moving into position, surveillance equipment being deployed, and coordination protocols being established. In 18 hours, the longest-running investigation in federal law enforcement history would either end in triumph or tragedy. Evelyn Torres, who had sought peace in the Colorado mountains after 12 years of military service, was about to fight the most important battle of her life. November 15th, 2024, 00:45 hours. The mountain darkness was complete, broken only by stars and the faint glow of tactical equipment displays. Evelyn lay prone on a ridge overlooking the train car clearing, watching through night vision. Scopes as the corruption network's operation unfolded exactly as Agent Martinez had predicted. The first vehicle had arrived 20 minutes earlier, a black SUV that disgorged 4 armed men who immediately established a security perimeter around the train car. They moved with military precision, suggesting professional training and combat experience. These weren't corrupt bureaucrats. They were professional killers hired to execute the final phase of Operation Sanctuary. Scout lay beside her, his body tense with controlled energy, every sense attuned to the threats below. His military training had never left him, and he understood that they were preparing for combat. "Alpha 1 to control," Evelyn whispered into her radio. 4 tangos in position around primary target. "No sign of the principals yet." Agent Martinez's voice came back through her earpiece. "Copy, Alpha 1. Beta and Charlie teams report similar deployments at secondary positions. They're setting up exactly as we anticipated. 2 more vehicles arrived in quick succession, a white van and another SUV. The van's rear doors opened to reveal sophisticated equipment. communications gear, surveillance monitors, and what appeared to be explosive devices. The second SUV disgorged 3 more armed men and 2 figures in business suits, who immediately took charge of the operation. Through her scope, Evelyn recognized one of the suit-wearing figures from the surveillance photos Agent Martinez had shown her. Paul Hendricks, former chief of police, now the field commander for the Corruption Network's enforcement operations. Alpha 1 to control. Primary target Hendricks on site. Repeat, we have visual confirmation of Hendricks. Copy Alpha 1. Federal teams are standing by for arrest authorization. At 0127 hours, the first delivery vehicle arrived. A nondescript sedan with tinted windows pulled into the clearing, and 2 men dragged a bound and hooded figure from the rear seat. Even from her elevated position, Evelyn could see that the victim was conscious but drugged. Stumbling as they forced him toward the train car, her radio crackled with traffic from multiple federal surveillance teams positioned around the operation. Each delivery was being documented, each perpetrator identified, each piece of evidence carefully recorded for the prosecutions that would follow. All units. This is control. Agent Martinez's voice carried the tension of 37 years of waiting. First victim is being moved to the primary target. Remember, we document everything, but do not engage until all targets are on site. The victim disappeared into the train car, and Evelyn had to force herself to remain in position. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene, to prevent another murder from taking place in the location where 43 people had already died. But the tactical plan required patience. They had to wait until all targets were present before moving. Over the next hour, 8 more vehicles arrived, each delivering bound victims to the train car. Evelyn counted 11 people being forced into the mobile prison where they would wait to be murdered in the same systematic way that had claimed lives for nearly 4 decades. At 02:45 hours, the final vehicle arrived, a black limousine that had clearly been modified for security purposes. When its doors opened, Evelyn saw the Corruption Network's ultimate leadership, Marcus Webb, director of the U.S. Marshal Service, and Janet Morrison, federal judge. They had come to personally oversee the operation that would eliminate the last threats to their criminal empire. Alpha 1 to control. Primary targets Webb and Morrison on site. All principals now present. Copy Alpha 1. All federal units, you are authorized to commence operation. Repeat, operation is authorized. Move in. The federal tactical teams moved with coordinated precision, emerging from concealed positions throughout the valley. Their approach was silent, professional, and overwhelming. 18 agents converging on the 12 operatives of the Corruption Network from multiple directions simultaneously. Evelyn watched through her scope as Marcus Webb realized what was happening. His head snapped up as he heard the first shouts of federal agents echoing through the clearing. For a moment he stood frozen, apparently unable to comprehend that the operation he thought was under his control was actually a carefully orchestrated trap. Paul Hendricks reacted faster, drawing a weapon and shouting orders to his security team. But the federal agents had tactical superiority, better positions, better equipment, and the advantage of surprise. The firefight that erupted was brief but intense. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness as the Corruption Network's operatives tried to fight their way out of what they finally realized was an ambush. But they were outnumbered, outpositioned, and completely unprepared for the level of federal response they faced. Scout's low growl alerted Evelyn to movement in her sector. 2 of the Corruption Network's men were trying to escape through the route she was covering. She sighted through her scope, marking their position for the federal teams moving up the slope behind them. Alpha 1 to control. 2 runners moving north through Sector 7. Federal units, adjust your intercept. Copy Alpha 1, we have them. Within 10 minutes, the shooting stopped. The Corruption Network's operational team was either dead or in federal custody, and the leadership that had orchestrated 37 years of murder and cover-up was in handcuffs. But the mission wasn't over. 11 victims were still trapped in the train car, and somewhere in the equipment van were the explosive devices that had been intended to destroy all evidence of the operation. Alpha 1 to control. Site secured. What's the status on victim rescue and explosive ordnance disposal? EOD team is moving on the van. Medical teams are standing by for victim extraction. Alpha 1, we need you to guide the rescue teams to the train car. You know the interior layout better than anyone. Evelyn made her way down from the ridge, with Scout at her side, moving through terrain she knew as well as her own cabin. The federal agents had secured the clearing, but the real work was just beginning. Rescuing 11 people who had been drugged and terrorized, and preserving evidence that would finally bring justice for 43 victims. Agent Martinez emerged from behind the communications van, her face showing the strain of 37 years of waiting for this moment. Ms. Torres, the EOD team found enough explosives to level half the mountain. If their plan had succeeded, no one would have ever found evidence of what happened here. What about the victims? Alive but traumatized. They've been drugged with something that keeps them conscious but compliant. Medical teams are working on reversing the effects. Evelyn approached the train car with a federal rescue team, her knowledge of the interior layout crucial for safely extracting people who were disoriented and frightened. Inside, 11 individuals sat bound to the steel rings that had held countless victims over the decades. Their eyes showed confusion and terror, but they were responsive when the agents began removing their restraints. "You're safe," Evelyn told each victim as they were helped from the car. "You're with federal agents. The people who brought you here are in custody." Among the rescued victims was a young journalist named David Park, who had been investigating corruption in federal law enforcement. Another was Maria Santos, the same Maria Santos who ran the diner in Cedar Falls, whose questioning of irregularities in local law enforcement had marked her for elimination. "Ms. Torres." Maria's voice was weak but recognizable. "What are you doing here?" "Helping to make sure you get home safely," Evelyn replied, supporting the older woman as they walked away from the train car that had been a death trap for so many others. The most emotional moment came when Agent Martinez approached the hidden compartment that had contained the personal effects of 43 victims. With federal prosecutors and evidence technicians documenting every step, she opened the compartment for the final time. 43 people, she said quietly. 43 families who've spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones. Today, they finally get answers. Each item in the compartment represented a life cut short, a family left devastated by loss they couldn't understand. The teddy bear that had belonged to a child victim. The wedding ring of a grandmother who had witnessed organized crime. The service medal of a veteran who had tried to expose corruption. But among the personal effects was the evidence that would ensure justice. Detailed records kept by Agent Martinez over 37 years. Documenting not just the deaths, but the network that had ordered them, the officials who had covered them up, and the system that had protected the killers. Federal prosecutors are going to have enough evidence to pursue RICO charges against the entire network. Deputy Attorney General Walsh announced as she arrived at the scene. This isn't just about individual murders. This is about dismantling a criminal organization that has operated within our government for 4 decades. The arrests continued throughout the morning as federal agents moved simultaneously across 6 states. Marcus Webb was taken into custody at his home in Virginia. Janet Morrison was arrested as she tried to board a private flight out of Denver. The network's financial backers, enforcement operatives, and political protectors found themselves in federal custody before they could destroy evidence or flee the country. By dawn, 37 people were under arrest on charges ranging from murder and conspiracy to obstruction of justice and racketeering. The corruption network that had seemed untouchable for nearly 4 decades was finally facing the justice system they had spent so long corrupting. Sarah Chen arrived at the scene as the sun was rising over the mountains. escorted by federal agents who had protected her throughout the operation. When Agent Martinez showed her the personal effects from the hidden compartment, including her father's conductor's watch, the moment of closure was profound. 37 years, Sarah said, holding the watch her father had been wearing when he died. 37 years of wondering, and now I finally know what happened to him. Your father died protecting people, Agent Martinez told her. He knew the witnesses on that train were in danger, and he tried to save them. His courage wasn't wasted. It just took 37 years for justice to catch up. The explosion that had been meant to destroy all evidence never came. Instead, the train car became the centerpiece of the largest prosecution of government corruption in American history. The evidence that Agent Martinez had collected over decades of patient investigation, combined with the documentation from the November 15th operation, provided federal prosecutors with an airtight case against every member of the network. As federal agents continued processing the crime scene and caring for the rescued victims, Evelyn found herself standing with Scout at the edge of the clearing, looking back at the train car that had held so many secrets for so long. "It's over," Agent Martinez said, joining her. 43 victims finally have justice. 11 potential victims are going home to their families. And the people responsible for all of it are going to spend the rest of their lives in prison. What happens now? Now we rebuild trust in the institutions they corrupted. We make sure something like this never happens again. And we honor the memory of everyone who died by making the system worthy of the faith people place in it. The corruption network that had begun with the murder of 15 federal witnesses in 1987 had finally been destroyed. But the work of justice was far from over. The trials, the investigations, the reforms, all of that lay ahead. But for Evelyn Torres, who had sought peace in the mountains and found herself fighting the most important battle of her life, the moment brought a satisfaction deeper than any she had experienced during her military service. She had helped bring 43 victims home, and she had proven that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. 6 months later, Evelyn Torres stood in a federal courthouse in Denver, watching as the last of the corruption network's leadership received their sentences. Marcus Webb, former director of the U.S. Marshal Service, had been sentenced to life in prison without parole. Janet Morrison, the federal judge who had used her position to protect killers, received the same sentence. Paul Hendricks and 28 other conspirators faced terms ranging from 30 years to life. The trials had been swift and decisive. The evidence Agent Martinez had collected over 37 years, combined with the documentation from the November 15th operation, had made conviction inevitable. Even the most skilled defense attorneys couldn't overcome the weight of physical evidence, recorded communications, and eyewitness testimony that prosecutors presented. Justice delayed is not justice denied, Deputy Attorney General Walsh had said during her closing argument in the final trial. These victims waited 37 years for this day, but their patience has been rewarded with truth, accountability, and the certainty that their killers will never harm anyone else. Outside the courthouse, Evelyn found Sarah Chen waiting with a small group of family members, relatives of the 43 victims whose deaths had finally been acknowledged and explained. The reunion was emotional but healing, a gathering of people who had spent decades wondering about lost loved ones and finally had answers. "Ms. Torres," said an elderly woman named Helen Washington, whose brother had been one of the 1987 witnesses, "I wanted to thank you for what you did. For 37 years, I wondered if my brother had run away, if he had abandoned his family, if he was still alive somewhere. Now I know he died trying to do the right thing, and that means everything to me." Similar conversations took place with other family members. Children who had grown up without parents, spouses who had never remarried because they held hope for their missing partners, siblings who had spent decades searching for answers. Each family's story was different, but all of them found healing in finally knowing the truth. Agent Martinez, whose real identity had been revealed during the trials, was planning her actual retirement. "37 years of living a lie," she told Evelyn as they walked through downtown Denver. "I'm looking forward to being Patricia Martinez again, to having a life that isn't defined by this case. What will you do?" "I'm thinking about teaching. Federal law enforcement, investigative techniques, maybe ethics courses for government employees. The system failed these victims because good people didn't speak up when they saw corruption. Maybe I can help train the next generation to be braver than we were." Evelyn's own life had changed in ways she was still processing. Her quiet existence as a wilderness guide had been replaced by frequent requests for consultation on federal investigations, speaking engagements about ethics and courage, and media interviews about the importance of citizens standing up to corruption. But more significantly, she had found a new sense of purpose. The isolation she had sought in the mountains remained valuable to her, but it was now balanced by engagement with the world beyond her cabin. She still guided hikers through the wilderness, but she also worked with federal agencies on training programs and consulted on cases involving organized crime and government corruption. Scout had adapted to their new responsibilities with typical canine resilience. He still loved their mountain hikes, but he also seemed to understand the importance of their work with law enforcement. During testimony at the trials, he had remained calmly beside Evelyn as she described their discovery of the train car, providing emotional support while she relived difficult memories. The train car itself had been preserved as evidence and would eventually become part of a memorial to the victims. The clearing where it sat had been transformed from a site of horror into a place of remembrance, where families could visit and honor relatives who had died trying to protect others. A granite memorial stone now marked the location, inscribed with the names of all 43 victims and a simple message: they died in service of justice. Their sacrifice was not forgotten. The memorial dedication ceremony had brought together federal officials, family members, and members of the mountain community who had supported the investigation. Maria Santos, the diner owner who had been targeted for elimination, spoke about the importance of ordinary citizens refusing to ignore corruption even when speaking up was dangerous. "These 43 people weren't professional heroes," she said. "They were regular folks who saw something wrong and chose to stand up against it. They paid the ultimate price for that courage. But their example shows us that democracy depends on citizens who are willing to put justice above personal safety." For Evelyn, the memorial ceremony represented closure, but also continuation. The corruption network had been destroyed, the victims had been honored, and justice had been served. But the broader work of protecting democratic institutions and ensuring government accountability would never end. As autumn returned to the Colorado mountains, bringing with it the anniversary of her discovery of the train car, Evelyn found herself hiking the same trail where her life had changed so dramatically. Scout walked beside her, alert but relaxed, comfortable in the mountains that had become both sanctuary and battleground. The trail looked the same as it had a year ago, the same towering pines, the same granite peaks, the same quiet beauty that had drawn her to this place after her military service. But Evelyn saw it differently now. The wilderness wasn't just a refuge from the world's problems. It was a reminder that some things were worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth the risk of leaving safety behind. She paused at the spot where Scout had first detected the train car, remembering the moment when her peaceful morning had become the beginning of the most important investigation in federal law enforcement history. The decision to investigate rather than ignore, to engage rather than retreat, had cost her the simple solitude she had valued, but had given her something more meaningful in return. Standing in the mountain silence with her faithful companion, Evelyn Torres understood that sometimes the most important discoveries happen when you're not looking for them, and sometimes life changes in the space between one footstep and the next. But those changes, however unexpected, could lead to purposes larger than any you might have chosen for yourself. The mountains held their peace. The victims had found their justice, and the work of protecting democracy continued. In the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.